10 stomach-turning reasons we should be glad we didn't live in the 19th century. The 19th century might be romanticized as a time of progress and grandeur, but in reality, it was riddled with hardships that would make modern living seem like a paradise. The rise of industrialization, unsanitary conditions, and lack of modern healthcare made life brutal for many. Let's take a look at 10 horrifying realities that make us glad we weren't living back then. 1. Awful medical experiments. Medical experimentation in the 19th century was crude, often inhumane, and dangerous. Procedures like trepanning, where holes were drilled into the skull, were common. The lack of sterilization, antibiotics, and effective anesthetics made surgeries excruciating and often fatal. Bloodletting and other questionable treatments were rampant, and doctors had free rein to try anything, no matter how bizarre or harmful. 2. Poison beer. Drinking beer in the 19th century wasn't the relaxing pastime it is today. Some breweries, particularly in places like Australia, added strychnine to their beer to give it a kick. Unsuspecting customers sometimes drank lethal doses, causing violent spasms and agonizing deaths. The lack of food safety regulations meant you never really knew what you were ingesting. 3. Living in filth. Waste management in cities was practically non-existent. Streets were filled with human and animal excrement, and trash littered every corner. In places like London and New York, rivers became sewers, causing rampant disease outbreaks. New York, in particular, had the added horror of thousands of horse carcasses and mountains of manure, making everyday life a smelly, disease-ridden nightmare. 4. Severe overcrowding in cities. The industrial boom caused mass urban migration, leading to extreme overcrowding in cities. Tenements in places like New York's Lower East Side were packed with families, and often, 10 or more people shared a room designed for half that. This close living meant that diseases spread quickly, and life was miserable for most residents. 5. Rampant disease and low life expectancy. The lack of sanitation and medical knowledge meant diseases like cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox were constant threats. Infant mortality rates were sky-high, and life expectancy was shockingly low, with many never reaching adulthood. Even if you survived childhood, diseases could claim you before your 30s, especially in overcrowded urban areas. 6. Appalling working conditions. Factories were dangerous places to work, and with no labor regulations, workers often faced 16-hour days with minimal pay. Injuries and deaths due to unsafe machinery were common, and even children were forced to work long hours in treacherous conditions. Workers' rights were non-existent, and laborers were easily exploited by greedy employers. 7. Low wages and bad food. Even with grueling work schedules, most workers received pitiful wages, often earning barely enough to survive. Their diets were lacking in nutrition, with meals consisting of bread, tea, and watery soups, leaving them malnourished and weak. The rich lived lavishly while the working class starved, making everyday survival a challenge. 8. Infanticide and baby farms. In an era without proper welfare systems, infanticide became a common crime, especially among poor mothers unable to care for their children. Baby farms, places where unwanted children were sent, were equally horrifying, with children often dying due to neglect, malnutrition, and squalid conditions. These practices led to the deaths of thousands of infants. 9. Crime and lack of law enforcement. Crime was rampant in the 19th century, particularly in cities. Drunkenness, theft, and violence were widespread, and with weak law enforcement, criminals could often get away with their misdeeds. Without forensic tools like fingerprinting or DNA evidence, many criminals were never caught, and the poor bore the brunt of an unjust system. 10. Brutal punishments. If you were caught committing a crime, you faced the brutal justice system of the time. Public executions, corporal punishment, and transportation to distant penal colonies were common sentences. The lack of due process meant many innocent people were wrongfully convicted, while many dangerous criminals walked free.